Welcome back to Inertia on Rails. This is episode 6. At this point, we've done a lot. We have an app running on Inertia for Rails. We set up Rails, we set up Inertia, we added devise and some basic authentication. We created recipes, we created routes and Inertia components to list the recipes, to view an individual recipe, and even create recipes. If you're just joining us and you're not completely comfortable with anything I just said, please go back and watch any of the other episodes to catch up a bit. If you are comfortable with those things, or you've been with us since the beginning, awesome, and welcome to testing with Inertia. So along the way, creating some of these pages, some of this functionality, I think we've probably hit a bug or some kind of typo on every single one of them. And I hope a lot of you were thinking, well, this is great, but how do I test this? It doesn't really fit the test model I'm used to. I want to make sure all of this is working. And the good news is Inertia is fantastic to test. And so let's jump in. Let's think about our features here. So the first thing we're going to do is something I'm sure a lot of you do with your Rails apps, and that's set up Rspec. Nothing against Minitest. I'm just used to Rspec, and because I'm used to Rspec, Inertia's testing helpers are currently only available for Rspec. If someone who prefers Minitest would like to jump in and help add some test helpers to Minitest, that would be fantastic. Open up an issue on the Inertia repo, get in touch with me, and we can go from there. So I know that some of this is going to be routine for some of you. I'm sure many of you are used to setting up Rspec. I expect something will go wrong here, but I kind of made a commitment to myself when this started that I didn't want to be one of those tutorial series that kind of skipped through all the installation steps. So that way, if users run into a problem, if you run into a problem, if I run into a problem, we can all work through it together. So you may want to fast forward if you have been using Rspec for a long time, but we are going to set it up now. So here is Rspec's GitHub, and I am just going to scroll down to, there we go, installation at Rspec Rails to both development and test. Perfect. So let's close down some files here. Go to our gem file, and we should have, yep, there's our development and test block. Awesome. In addition to Rspec, I think Rspec goes hand in hand. I'm sure any testing strategy goes hand in hand with something like FactoryBot. So I am also going to add FactoryBot at the same time. And I don't think FactoryBot has some setup. Either way, we need to bundle install. And we will get into setup for both of these. So Rspec said after we bundle install, we need to run Rspec install. Okay, this is a good start. Cool, and we can generate our specs. That is awesome. Let's see how this went. Let's just run Rspec. 0 examples, 0 failures. That's a good start. So let's generate one. Sorry. Rails generate Rspec controller. Recipe controller. Oh, I did it again, didn't I? Did I mean recipes controller? I think I did. Okay, I think I did. Yep, I definitely did. So let's fix this right away. I meant to call this recipes controller spec. And since this actually refers to a class we have, I'm just going to do that. And let's run Rspec again. And hopefully, cool. Recipes controllers, huh? There we go. 1 example, 0 failures, 1 pending. So we will get into FactoryBot in a second. For now, we want to make sure we have Rspec completely set up. So one of the first problems we'll run into is that everything is behind our login. So that's something we're going to have to test. Luckily, Devise has some helpers for that. So if we go into Rails helper, and I know that I'm not, normally I would bring up guides for this, but I'm not even sure where the best guide is for this. I've probably assembled this knowledge primarily through Stack Overflow, like most of my knowledge. But we are going to go into the Rails helper, and we are going to require Devise. Now that we've done that, we'll notice this is considered a request spec. So down here, anywhere at the bottom, we're going to tell the config to include Devise, integration helpers of type request. And this will tell the type request, I believe, tells this to load automatically for request specs. And then I like to just create some methods down here. We're going to define a method if equals nil. And we will say user. If you pass a user, great. You know what? Let's not even have the option. Let's just create sign in. And what sign in is going to do is sign in. All right, so I ended up getting to this earlier than I thought. We're going to get into FactoryBot immediately. User, let's do this. User equals FactoryBot.create user. Sign in user, and then we'll return the user. So what is FactoryBot? I don't want to get into it too far, but FactoryBot basically is a nice tool that allows you to create models for tests. So if you need data in any of your tests, FactoryBot is a great way to do that. So let's set up FactoryBot as well here. I think all we need to do for that is have our config include FactoryBot, syntax, methods. And all this is going to do is make it so within our tests, we don't have to run FactoryBot.create. We can just say create. Kind of a small thing, but small things are nice. Let's look and see if FactoryBot will tell us how to generate. It does not. So, nope, that's not going to work. Let's see what Rails task we have generated now. We probably have plenty. Let's see if, oh, I guess it would be a generator. Let's see, is there any Rails generate FactoryBot? Oh, here we go. Did you mean FactoryBot model? Maybe I did. Oh, did I mean factory_bot model? Maybe I did. There we go. Okay. So this gives us a factory. Now, what this factory is going to do is we can put in information about a user, like fixed information, for example. And these are essentially the defaults. And now we have a user that we can create in our tests. And what's great is, and this is something we've already done, since we have Faker set up, we should be able to do something like Faker email. I don't know what the syntax of it is, so let's check. That's Faker, oops, not Rails Faker, Ruby Faker. And let's see, scroll down to our defaults. Faker under internet, cool. So we can do faker internet email, faker name.name. Great. So if we don't explicitly pass an email or a name to use in tests, Faker will just make one up for us. Okay, I think we're getting somewhere here. So why did we do all of this setup? Well, let's write the beginning of our test. Describe get index is a good place to start, but let's start with an even simpler one. Let's describe new first. And the reason I want to test new first is because if we remember what our recipes controller looks like, new is our simplest route. All it's doing is returning a component. So what do we want to put in our test file here? Well, our test needs to do a couple of things. We want to send a request to /new, see if what we expect to be returned is returned. Easy enough, right? So at least sounds pretty straightforward. So let's put in it block. It renders an inertia component. So what are we going to do? We're going to say get recipes, I wonder what it's named, recipes new path maybe? I think we can say Rails routes. Let's find out what the name of it. New recipe. So I'm going to guess it's the new recipe path. So we're going to get that path. And then now here's the problem. How do we tell that it rendered the right component? Well, we actually have an easy way to do that thanks to Inertia test helpers. So how do we set up Inertia test helpers? Well, we go back to Rails helper here, and all we have to do is require it. We just require Inertia Rails Rspec. So what will this give us? Now, if you've read through the Inertia docs, you are looking quizzically at this video because this is actually undocumented right now. So how do you find out about undocumented things? Well, first of all, we should document them. So I don't want to pretend like this is a good thing, but it's always helpful to occasionally look at the source of the packages you're using. And in this case, especially those packages specs. So in this case, if we look at the Inertia Rails repo, we can see that it has a spec folder. It has Inertia specs, and it has this one called Rspec helper specs, which, as you can probably guess, tests the Rspec helpers. And why would we look at the tests? Well, because the tests tell us what the repo expects to do. It tells us what the code base has. And one of the things in it is we can test expect inertia to render a component. So let's give that a try. Let's just copy this exactly. Go back to our spec, and let's see how we're doing. So we're going to run our spec, and we're going to hit our first problem, uninitialized constant devise integration helpers. Okay, so let's go back to our Rails helper. That's where this is coming from. We are requiring devise. But if I look at my own example, I would know that I'm missing a module. Okay, so next problem. Inertia test helpers aren't set up. Make sure you add inertia true to describe blocks using inertia tests. Now that is a pretty straightforward error. Thank you to Chris Toomey for actually helping us realize that inertia error. That error wasn't very good before. So what that means is, in order for Rspec to know that it needs to be working with inertia, we need to tell it it's going to be working with inertia. So in this describe new, we're just going to let it know this is an inertia test. And that tells it to do some things like stub out and mock some inertia properties so it can check to see what's rendering. So let's see what's next. Undefined method component for nil class. This is happening here. So we have expect inertia to render component for nil class. Okay, I think this is actually kind of a deceptive error. Inertia thinks it's an inertia error, but it's not. If we look at, what do I want to check? We want to check the Rspec response header. And I think what we'll see is that it's not what we expect. If we said expect response, let's just put the response. Now we expect a 200 here, right? Because we're just expecting a normal response. And yeah, there we go. We're getting a 302. Why is that? And we're actually getting a warning here as well. This test never created an inertia renderer. Maybe the code wasn't able to reach a render inertia call. And that is exactly what's happening here, because we are slamming into devise. Devise is receiving this request and redirecting us to the login path. And if you remember, that's why we set this up. That's why we created this nice sign-in method so that we can avoid this whole situation. So let's just let this know that before it runs anything, let's go ahead and sign in. All right, we're still failing. What did we get here? Expected rendered inertia component to be test component, instead received create recipe. Now that's a good error, because this was copy pasted from some docs. The component we actually expected was create recipe. Let's see if we get green. There we go. Now we're moving. Awesome. So let's test something else. And this is going to move a lot quicker now that all of our setup is done. Let's test the index. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's say describe index. Now, I could put inertia true here as well, but I think I can just put it there at the top. So we're going to describe the index. And this is where we can use our factories. So we don't have a factory for a recipe just yet. Let's make one. FactoryBot model recipe. Now we have a recipes factory. And we know that a recipe is made up of a name. What was the food? It was, we can check by looking at our seeds. Dish. The name is food.dish. And the description is description. So now we can see a little bit of the power of FactoryBot here. We want to create some recipes. List, and we'll just create 2. That's enough to know. Now, so that's great. It renders the recipes. So first things first, we're going to do the same test we did above. Expect inertia to render component. This time, which component is it? It's recipe list. So this should pass. Oh, that wasn't the last command I ran. There we go. This should pass. Oh, it did not. Undefined method component. Ah, did I not sign in? No, I did sign in. Oh, I signed in, but I never actually hit the route. There's our good old warning. Never hit an inertia render. Now we should be green, and we are. Excellent. But this isn't a great test, right? Because we want to know a little more than that. It's great to know it's rendering recipe list, but it would be even better to know that it was rendering recipe list with these recipes. And the only way we're going to do that is first we need to make sure that the recipes are assigned to the right user. So let's change this before sign in to let user sign in so we can get them. And we're going to do let user with a bang because that makes sure that this is run without waiting. Normally lets in Rspec are lazy. They don't run until they're used. We want this to run immediately. So now we should have a user down here so that we can pass that user to our factory. And we need to let our user know to expect that. And we're not going to put any block after it because we don't want a default user. We want it to always need a user passed to it. So test is still green. We're going to use another inertia test helper. Expect inertia 2, include props. Include props expects a hash of props. And include is a little different than has exact props. There's another helper, if we look at our docs here. Hold on. There we go. Have exact props. That would make sure the props exactly match. We want include props, which means it's okay if they don't exactly match. And the reason for that is we don't want this test to break if someone later adds another prop to our global props, like how we handle our inertia share user. That shouldn't impact this specific test. So we're going to use include props. And we're going to say it should get recipes that are the recipes. So let's run that. And we got an error. We expected inertia props to include recipes, the list of recipes, but instead we received a user, which is fine. And that's it. And there we go. There's recipes, but it's empty. Why is that? Well, same problem as above. And the reason I did this is because it trips me up a lot. We need to remember that when you're testing API calls like this, force Rspec to create things in advance. Now we should be in good shape. And we have our second test. So let's do, what's our next test? Let's go back to our recipes controller. Let's test our show method. So now we're going to move a little quicker because I think we have the basics down, and we're going to use a little bit of copy paste too. The only difference between this test and the index test is that we want one less recipe. So instead of using create list, we're just going to use create. We are going to get the recipe path for that recipe. We expect inertia to render recipe, and we expect it to just be the recipe. Are we still passing? We are still passing, moving right along. Oh, and now we're back to a tough one. So how do we set up create? Well, it's pretty straightforward actually. What we can do is example recipe, and then we're actually still going to use FactoryBot, except this time we're going to use build. What build does is it's going to return you a model, except it's not going to persist the model. So we can use it if we just want to get some example columns like we do here. So we're just going to say build recipe, because we just want to get that fake data out. It creates a recipe. So we are going to be posting. And now I think this is a little different. I think we need, okay, sorry, I was just referring to some syntax because I needed to remember how to do post. So we're going to say post recipes path, and then we're going to pass params name, recipe name, description, recipe.description. Now what should happen? Well, our usual thing should happen. Inertia should render a component. Which component should it render? Well, this is kind of interesting. You can kind of test this in a couple different ways. You can test if we redirected, or you can kind of ignore that concept and test if we ended up in the right place. I think they're both kind of interesting ways to look at this. So in this way, let's just test the redirect here. So, and this is kind of an important thing, I think. Back when we installed Devise, we didn't do any work to make that inertiafied. We just let Devise work as Devise does. And it does that with a traditional post to the server. And I think that's one of the biggest strengths of Inertia. And I mentioned it then, and I think it bears repeating. One of the best parts about Inertia is that you aren't tied to it. When you write a single page app, every piece of structure in that app has to deal with that paradigm. With Inertia, it doesn't. If something is more convenient to test or write as a traditional MVC setup, just do that. That's perfectly reasonable. And the flip side, if you only want to use Inertia a little bit for maybe a specific part of your site, just do that too. So it's important not to get caught in the, well, it's Inertia, so it has to be Inertia. No, it doesn't. This has nothing to do with Inertia. And instead of expecting a render, I'm going to just expect the response to redirect to recipe path. And we'll cheat a little bit. It should be 2, I think, because this is going to redirect to recipes path. Oh, I guess it'll be 1 because 1 doesn't actually exist yet. And let's see if this works here. Oh, and I also want to make sure, I know why this is seeming silly, because I want to make sure the new recipe was created. So we should be able to get new recipe equals recipe.first, expect. Why do I keep saying title? There we go, and then we can expect that to render the recipe path with our new recipe. Let's see if we did okay. All right, we have a failure, undefined local variable. Oh, because it'll be easier to change that. I named that example recipe just to kind of differentiate that it wasn't persisted. And there we go. Let's test one more thing here. Let's make sure that our user was associated correctly. And there we go. And I think it's really cool to point out there's no inertia in this at all. This is a completely normal Rspec test. And isn't that awesome that you aren't tied down to inertia? If inertia is a strategy that doesn't work for a particular section of your application or isn't necessary, just don't use it. And in this case, there was no reason to use inertia to test this specific route. All of these, it was great to use inertia. So there we go. We have 4 examples, 0 failures. We have 4 methods in this controller, or at least 4 public methods. Our test coverage is pretty good. And that's all there is to it. If you are interested in learning more about inertia tests, there is, I would recommend looking at the inertia repo, or looking at the Inertia Rails repo for them. This really is high on my priority list to get documented. So I need to get back on that. Or if you're interested in contributing to Inertia, it would be fantastic for someone to get that started. But just to quickly recap, writing inertia tests in the Rails helper, all we have to do is require the Inertia Rails Rspec helpers. And what those provide us is this expect inertia that has some extra matchers like render component or include props. It is more than that, but 90% of my tests use only these 2. And inertia not required. If it's easier and if it makes sense to test like this without inertia at all, then don't use it. Don't force yourself to use inertia just because inertia is in your app. That's all. I know this one was pretty quick and it covered a lot, and it covered a lot that wasn't inertia. But like I said, I really wanted to set out to not use that kind of cooking show magic here and to really step by step go through all of this. So in this step, we added Rspec, we added FactoryBot, we created some fixtures, we tested every route, every path in our recipes controller, and we're in a good spot. I am not sure what we'll do in the next segment. We will probably dive into more app features, perhaps adding ingredients. Maybe we'll wire up that search box. Either way, I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So thank you for watching this far. As always, I'm Brandon Shar. I still work at Bellawatt. We still created and maintain the Inertia Rails gem. Thank you for watching.